you. Thank you for 1,000 things that neither you or I now remember, but that have lined my heart with a capacity for love. Thank you for reading me to sleep night after night after night until I was ready. Thank you for holding my hand on the way to school and treating us to ice creams on the way home, just because they were genuine Italian ice cream in a small shop needing supporting. Thank you for making us walk from youth hostel to youth hostel, propelled by the story of the map that you showed us how to read. Thank you for driving me to university with a carload of stuff and the belief that I could do this. And thank you for your patience as I explored the world in my 20s with a curiosity that forgot the needs of my parents. Thank you for pushing my baby Omni in a buggy around the streets of Lambeth so you could bring her in for a feed on my lunch break. Thank you for being my refuge when I needed it, and not asking too many questions, but just chatting to keep my spirits up. Thank you for welcoming Dimitri into your heart and our family. Thank you for driving across London at night to look after Omni whilst Theo was being born, for being a man in her life that held her safe. And thank you for taking the toddler Theo on any train he liked, from one end of the map to the other, for enrolling him in multiple libraries across London, so you would always have books to share. Thank you for dropping everything without a second thought to come and look after Xander when he got sick in my first week of a new job. Thank you for putting your grandchildren before your own tiredness, for always finding joy in their company, and for filling our lives with laughter. And most of all, thank you for loving me in such a way that allows me to love my own children in the only way I know how, our way.
In the first week of our first year at University of Cape Town as students, we were in overlapping programs. We got to know each other. That interaction grew because we were both active in a lot of student politics. And so I think what you could describe that phase in Cape Town as a casual friendship. We didn't socialize very much, but we interacted quite often. It then became a much stronger, much firmer friendship when we reconnected in Zambia, in Lusaka. Eventually, because we both taught at the University of Zambia. And I'll say a little bit about that just now. And then finally in Britain, where the friendship, I think, became the strongest and the most, the deepest. We shared a lot of personal problems. We also shared ideas. It's quite funny to think that over those 40 years, I think of those as the most intense part of our friendship. We actually conducted an awful lot of it on the phone, rather than in person. Partly the wretched pandemic, and partly because I lived in Leeds for a long time, but also because it just became convenient. Every week to 10 days there was a phone call. They often went on for 30 minutes or more, and we basically solved the problems of the world on all those. I think just to talk briefly about UCT, it was 1960 and the early 60s was a time of tremendous ferment on the campuses. We were in the shadow of the Sharpeville massacre, which had taken place in 1960. We were at a university where the English language universities felt under pressure because of racial divisions that had been imposed on them by legislation. It was a time, although most of us didn't realize it until too late, when the police state was being set in. Right? And so it was a very highly politicized existence. And the National Union of Students, NUSAS, was one of the most important articulating sources of criticism of apartheid and the insistence on a non-racial society. Robert threw himself into that very much, but he did that because he had, I think, tremendous respect on the campus. I don't think we had been students for more than 2 weeks when it became apparent that he was, by a country mile, the most brilliant member of that first-year cohort. He was articulate, he was very organized in his mind, and he was just streets ahead of the rest of us. Whereas we floundered and plodded and hoped to find our feet as first-year students, he just raced away. And that was translated into his activities on the campus. He became a very forceful speaker for a democratic non-racial order. Some people who were there at the time would remember him addressing a really huge gathering in Cape Town's cavernous Jamison Hall and pointing out the special branch policemen standing at the back and inviting them to come up and introduce themselves. On another occasion, this is on a much lesser scale, but I still remember it with fondness, we went down from, I don't know if everybody knows, the University of Cape Town is perched halfway up Devil's Peak. It's on a mountain, very magnificent setting. But it's a very steep walk up and down to the suburbs below. And we were part of a group of students. We all just happened to be walking down to Rondebosch from the campus. About halfway along, we came across a group of Africans digging a ditch or a trench, not sure, with picks along the side of the road. And a very, very, very large white supervisor sitting on a big wooden box, giving them advice, which was largely made up of, hurry up, work harder, you're too slow, we need to be finished by now. We still watched this for a bit, and then Robert suggested that it would actually go faster, the work would go faster, and they would finish quicker if he got off his box and joined his team. And luckily there were enough of us to drag Robert away before his face was rearranged. I think one of the things that perhaps illustrates his intellectual sharpness was, I had a motor accident and I couldn't take notes in lectures, and there was one particular course where the lectures were everything. There wasn't a textbook that replaced it. He kindly offered to lend me his lecture notes, and I was really startled when I got them, because they were in 4 colors, and not for aesthetic reasons. You know, one color was the main point, the other was a subordinate point, the third one was a subordinate point of the subordinate point, the fourth one was a reference or some legal concept in Latin or something like that. And I was just amazed. I thought to myself, here's this guy sitting there while this lecturer rambles on, and he did ramble. And he's sitting there clutching this fistful of pens and spitting out the man's thoughts as he goes on. And I think that, for me, I've always remembered that, because it was a very good example of what he was intellectually. I think in the mid-60s, our association in Cape Town ended because Robert became gravely ill, and I won't dwell on that. I think if Marion wants to talk about it, it's okay. And I went back to Zambia, where I lived, because my parents were themselves quite ill and I needed to handle their affairs. 3 years after that, though, the Moltenos turned up in Lusaka in Zambia. And first, Robert was a researcher for a while, but then became a lecturer at the University of Zambia. I realized they were in Lusaka for the first time because they were struggling to find accommodation until proper accommodation could be found for them. And they got a bed sit from my mother, who had this bed sit. One room with a small kitchen and a bathroom off it. And the two of them survived in that. I don't know for how long. How long were you there? A year. Gosh. You know, 20 odd years later, I actually occupied that little flat when I was in Lusaka on a research trip. And I remember a Jesuit priest that I had befriended who was helping me with the research coming to hand me some papers, and he looked around at this place with some distaste and said, "A Trappist monk wouldn't agree to that." So, anyway, eventually both of us ended up as teaching at the University of Zambia, and that was itself also another political hotbed. If anything, the situation was even more tense, more fraught. Zambia had just become independent in 1965. Ian Smith had declared unilateral declaration in Rhodesia. That had effectively cut off Zambia's supply lines, a landlocked country. Petrol was short. We used to get a weekly ration. I remember one week we got 4 pints. You know, it was that kind of a situation. There was an anti-colonial war going on in Mozambique on the country's eastern border, and another one going on in Angola on the country's western border. So it was a very difficult, very tense time, and there was a very nervous government. But the situation on the campus was that people associated very much with this political context. All the talk was about revolution and development and equality and independence. All the students were concerned about was that kind of thing. Robert fitted in absolutely perfectly. Here was a chance to promote the values that he held: social democracy, of a socialist democracy, and I think he put his heart into the work at the University of Zambia in a way that I think nothing else was ever again going to equal that. He taught the most inspirational lectures. The students reacted and responded to that by being inspired and by taking into their hearts. Are you signaling the time's out? No? You're going to have to pull the tractor. I still have something to say. Robert wrote lectures, he wrote correspondence courses for the university. He published a number of papers, a very important one on factionalism, which became an inspiration for a lot of other work on tribalism and factionalism. The situation was so intense that one time I remember he got into a terrific argument in the staff common room with a young American lawyer who had only just arrived in Zambia, first time out of the United States, was quite shocked to find this ferment of revolutionary ideas and also to find that the CIA was not the most popular organization. The argument escalated, and eventually this lecturer said to Robert, "You know what the trouble is? The trouble is that your ideas are positively Dickensian." Robert wasn't fazed at all. He said, "Well, Dickens would have insisted on abolishing poverty, increasing equality, and increasing social justice. I'm happy to be Dickensian." and if I can add, and it may allow me, that stick is getting ominously dangerous. If you allow me, I would add another, if you want, Dickensian quality, and that is his kindness and his consideration for other people. And a lot of that was reflected in his teaching, in his extramural work, and so on. And I do want to tell you a story which exemplifies his kindness. The fact that so many of us are here today tells us how he kept in touch with people. Robert needed people, and he cared for people. About 3 years ago, he and I went into London to see a film. We came out, we went to Waterloo Station, it was rush hour. Robert was, of course, fully launched on why the film was no good. And people were scurrying back and forth, and there was a short man, an Asian man, with a backpack that seemed to be larger than him, standing there helplessly, holding out a piece of paper, and everybody just rushed by, except one person. Robert stopped. The man, the letter said he had an invitation to a seminary somewhere in some remote small town in England. And on the other hand, he had a train ticket to go there, but that was as far as he knew. He spoke no English, we spoke no whatever it was. We guessed he was Korean, but we it was just a guess. Robert gets him by the arm, takes him off to the ticket office, to the information office, finds out where this place is, what line it's on, what platform, takes him to the platform, the turnstile guard lets Robert onto the platform. He goes onto the platform, he stands with this guy, on a piece of paper he draws a line indicating how many stops before the chap has to get off. 40 minutes later he puts him on a train and goes. Now, I don't know many people, I have to say, who would do that, who would change that. And I think, you know, that exemplified him. Much of my time as his friend, much of my time being privileged to be his friend, was spent in watching him at this kind of thing. We had long conversations, as I've suggested, solving the world's problems. Racism, I'm going to stop him. or poverty. One of the things that perhaps sums it up was that when Robert was detained, and I'm afraid I can't tell you about the detention, although I will answer questions afterwards. When Robert was detained, he and another 5 lecturers eventually were released one after another and handed deportation notices. And I went to the airport to see people a lot of times during that horrible time. One week, a friend of ours, of Robert's and mine, was given a send-off. We went to the airport concourse was packed in the soccer to see him. Nearly all the people there were expatriate lecturers, members of the university and so on. A week later, Robert went, and the concourse once again was packed. By this time, a great deal of the audience was Zambian, and many of them were in tears. And I think if there is a tribute to him, that probably is as good a tribute as any. So I will finally shut up, May.
Marion said, just tell the people who worked with him more recently, which is a very great many of you, what it was he did professionally here in England. So he was for more than 25 years the chief editor at Z Books, which specialised in publishing serious books about what was then called the Third World, from a critical, radical perspective. And it sought books by academics and by activists, where possible, by authors from the countries that the books were about. Robert was asked by Z's founder, Roger Swanenberg, who may be here, to read a manuscript that Z was considering. And Roger's colleague, Mike Pallis, travelled to Sussex, where they were living after they left Zambia. Marion was teaching at Eastbourne, and Robert stayed home with the children, who were very young. On his return, Mike told Roger that not only had the task been performed with aplomb, this exercise in peer review, really, but also that he might have found a candidate to become the press's editor, which they'd be looking for. I suppose what impressed Mike was the quality of Robert's engagement with the manuscript and with the task he'd been asked to do. I imagine that Robert was highly articulate. Well, the Moltenos moved to London, and Robert indeed became Z's editor. The company was very small. In those early days, each had to learn all aspects of publishing: book production, finance, marketing, publicity. There were a lot of tasks to get on top of. Each person had to do a bit of everything. One important bit was seeking co-publishing arrangements, perhaps in the country, or at least in the continent, with which the book was concerned. Roger was very good at that, actually, but he moved on in the mid-80s, and Robert did a lot of that as well. It's not the same as editing. He tried everything a bit, and he knew how to. When I worked with him, I know he'd copy edited. He knew how to do that. He knew about proofreading. He knew, and all the other bits, the marketing and things like that. He knew about those things. I met Robert in autumn of 1978 actually. I typeset a book for Zed and he brought me the proofs for correction. Now some years later I was looking for work and so I approached Zed and we remembered each other. And by then the company had grown to 10 dozen people I think. And it had a finance department, a marketing department, a publicity department and a production department, in addition to Robert and another person who worked at the editorial department. So he sat me down at his own desk for the first day. There was a particular task he wanted done and he thought, right, I can do it. He gave me some proofs that needed urgent checking and it was a job that was likely to take some time. There was no one else in the room at the time, quite a big room. He put me at his desk and he settled himself on the other side of the room and suddenly burst into speech. Well, I turned round rather surprised. And he was chatting warmly, directly, highly communicatively, economically, to the point, to a dictaphone. He was writing letters. I wasn't used to this kind of thing. Some were short. Your letter arrived. Thank you. My warm regards. But most were substantial, responsive, moving a conversation on. You might suggest modifying a line of argument, or splitting a chapter into two, or bringing two chapters together, or tell the author that they should write an overarching introduction, or a concluding summary. In a couple of hours, he'd written 60 letters. He had a lively contact with a vast network of people, each of whom came vividly into my mind's eye as I was eavesdropping, which convinced me that each was vividly in his mind's eye as he was talking to this plastic machine in front of him. And as I got to know the company better and I saw the correspondence in the files, it was clear that those authors and others with whom Robert kept in such assiduous contact had felt the same. They were looked after, they were kept in touch with. Writing was a solitary business, and it was palpable in so many authors' correspondence that they knew that there was someone, as it were, holding the other end of the rope. One example from Kasturi Sen, who I think is also here. She proposed in 1992 a book on the poorly understood topic of the social understanding of and policies towards ageing and old age in various places. She refers to, and I quote her, Z Books, one of the most sought after, progressive, innovative publishers in the world with a string of radical authors. My proposal was accepted, raising eyebrows in British academia where some wondered how two foreigners could manage to get acceptance on such a topic that was of little interest. Robert knew this, and he was determined to show that we were also worthy of support. With his sharp intellect and focus, he could be scary at our early meetings, but at the same time, he was incredibly encouraging. He was scrutinising and demanding intellectually for content and for style, and for us to meet tight deadlines. Well, that book was published and Kasturi went on to write a second book with Zed. Now, by contrast, sometimes he got to commission books. He had the idea. Julian Berger, who I think might also be here, was commissioned. He'd been a staff member at a little NGO called the Anti-Slavery Society. And Robert, I don't know how he found time for this with family and his job, served on the board of governors or trustees or something. And the board and the staff used to meet now and again, every few months or so, to keep up on work. And Julian worked on the politics of indigenous people around the world, and Robert's publishing years. He commissioned Julian to write a book that became Reports from the Frontier, which set out the position of the different indigenous people around the world and their struggles against incursions and colonialism and devastating environmental degradation. Robert knew that there was no book dealing with these matters, and there was a gap to be filled. And in these, that's just two examples. I calculated once, and I'm not sure if I'm quite right. He was a midwife to over 1,000 books. Now, as a colleague, as a colleague, Robert functioned, Zed functioned as a workers' club. It was run by all of us. The decision on what to publish was actually taken by consensus. So Robert, as the chief editor, convened the editorial meetings, and he was always articulate, fluent, very clear. That includes when he was undecided, didn't know what to think. He would step back and explore the different, what it was he had doubts about, and explore the contrary argument. And he would articulate it and clarify it. It clarified everybody's thinking, and it kept everything moving. And his focus, his intelligence, and that articulacy was always an enormous gift. And that gift was from him to us. So I think of those years when we worked together with huge gratitude, and my gratitude is to him. After he retired from Z, he worked briefly at the part-time at the International African Institute, which had an office in South. A small foundation that published a few books and a very prestigious journal actually. And he maintained it and developed it for a few years and before handing over to a very able successor. After which he continued to work on that institute's board as well. And as you said, I also was thunderstruck when I heard that Robert had died, and I think we all were. He went out like a light, and as May said, it's deeply shocking. But it's also fitting, because he lived like a light.
I met Robert 43 years ago. So now take yourself back, if you're old enough, and most of you are, 1979. In that year, a person called Margaret Thatcher had become the Prime Minister of this country. And she had a list of things that she was against. She was against them because they had power against her. So one of them happened to be the Greater London Council, which was sort of a big authority over the 32 boroughs that were London. And within that, there was something called the Inner London Education Authority. And this was very, very special because it was trying to get quality education for all our children. So in 1979, when I was teaching in Southfield School, and in those days I went by my married name of Julia Alterman, and we had a governor at our school, and one of our governors was called Christopher Chope, and he was the leader of Wandsworth Council. Meanwhile, the other side of Wandsworth, in Battersea, Robert Molteno was a governor at his Honeywell School, where May and Star were children. And in his infinite wisdom, Mr. Chope decided to announce to the parent at a parents' evening at Southfield School that he was going to take Wandsworth out of Ilion. Now, obviously, he knew Thatcher's plans. It was obviously a shot across the bows. Let's see how it goes. Well, he chose the wrong place, because he chose the place where Robert Molteno was. Now, you've already heard how marvellous he was at so many things, so I don't need to say too much, but a few little things. The first time I met Robert was at a meeting where people from different organisations, because obviously I represented the teachers and there were other unions were represented and the parents were represented, and of course Robert was there representing the parents. And he said to me, we've got this organisation, we think we're going to call it the Wandsworth Association of School Parents. He said, they're a bit worried about that. He said, because WASP, he said, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And we looked at each other and we laughed. And I said, I don't think most people know, and they won't care. And if you think about it, if you want to have a campaign, being a WASP is perfect, isn't it? Because WASPs are annoying, they're irritating, and they never give up. Yeah? And of course, Robert wasn't those things, but he never gave up. And he was magnificent. So I'm going to quote now from Liz Nussbaum, who was one of the many people who became Robert's friends through the campaign. And she said, I'll never forget my first encounter with Robert. A WASP meeting, hall full of angry parents, Robert on the platform explaining, analysing with masterful clarity and a passionate commitment that left us all energised and full of hope. He was an inspirational speaker. For me, it was an unforgettable moment, not just as a school parent, but for the over 40 years of enriching friendship it led to. In many ways, Liz says it all. And so when I met Robert, I thought, miracles, I've got somebody I can really work with here. We can get somewhere. There were monstrous meetings, and not 1,000 people, and one meeting after it, there'd been a vote at the end, and 99% of us had voted to save area, and there were a few brave Tories in the room who'd voted the other way. And Councillor Chope said to me after that meeting, "You will win every meeting, but the silent majority will be with me." Unfortunately, the man was right. So, we did our best, and I don't think there has ever been, I may be wrong, but I've never heard of a campaign that was quite so well run as Robert managed to get things going in Wandsworth. He went all over the place, he became sort of famous. We had all sorts of bright ideas, because one thing that Robert said was, it's got to be fun. We want the children to come along, the parents to come along, it's going to be good. So we came up with this idea, because in March of 1980, Thatcher said she was going to abolish Ilia. And so we thought we'd have a riverboat campaign of the different areas of London. We can come up the river and we can all join and we can have a demonstration in front of Parliament. Now this is actually illegal, but anyway, we didn't let that get in the way. And so we organised this thing, and it was a wonderful occasion. But of course the Wandsworth boat was the biggest and the best, and we had all the balloons and the banners, and it was absolutely marvellous. And then we got in front of Parliament, and there were people drinking on the terrace there, I can remember seeing them. And then the police arrived, the river police arrived, but it didn't matter. People pointed at Robert and me as the people who'd organised it, and somehow they didn't seem to care. I suppose they told us not to be bad again or something like that. I don't know really. And it was just wonderful. And so we actually made a lot of progress, and all of London joined in, and right across with the TUC, all sorts of different organisations. I don't know, but I reckon probably Robert was the first member of leader of a parent organisation to go to the TUC. It was a very, very interesting sort of mix. It was very, very successful, but of course we had very significant opposition. So Alf Dubs had got elected at the same time as Thatcher became Prime Minister, and in 1983 Thatcher had a landslide victory. Alf Dubs won again. And Alf Dubs did say that when they tell the history of these times, they must say how the parents and the teachers and the people who worked in the schools fought for their education service. And that was true. But the trouble is that the political situation was against us. In 1986, the GLC was abolished. Amazingly, we survived. Why did we survive? Because we had lobbied in the Lords, and the Lords were on our side. So it was really quite amazing. And Robert endlessly speaking all over London. I mean, Marion must have never seen him. And it was, just really quite amazing. The most brilliant speaker. To me, he sounded like David Attenborough. And you can't really say better than that. And anyway, so we get to the stage where we think, if Thatcher will win lose the next election, we can win. But of course, Thatcher did not lose the next election. In fact, she had an absolute landslide victory. And so, slowly, Ilia died, which to me is a great sadness, and I still find it difficult to look at County Hall. So I'm up to time, so I will shut up. Just finally to say that afterwards, after we hadn't won, Robert made a friend for life. And I just want to say, simply the best.
I'm going to talk about Robert's involvement with the struggle for fairer streets in Wandsworth and London, and the enormous role that Robert played in that over the last 10 years. Robert was an unusual campaigner, as he had such a broad set of skills and abilities, and he played this to the fullest degree. He combined a number of elements, one of which was he was strategic and fabulous at developing policy. He was the most, as Morris has alluded and others have alluded to, he was the most able and assiduous note-taker any community group could ever want to find. And the minutes that he did were so fantastic. And And also, as we'll see, he was a supreme organiser who was focused on getting things done that made a difference. And I think that was the key thing, really. He wanted to change things in a really positive way. But hugely important too, again, and this has been touched on so many times, was his character. And in campaigning, it's not always easy. But his ability to work with everyone, to be polite, charming, to be liked and respected by all. But again, the thread as well that's come up here, and I must say I noticed in all the photographs, nearly everyone Robert's laughing. And I just think that was, again, in campaigning, everybody gets a bit serious. But what was wonderful about Robert was you would never end a conversation without a smile and a laugh. And it was a truly uplifting part of what it was to campaign with Robert. So what got Robert started? He was involved in the environmental movement for many years, but I think he saw streets as somewhere where there's an opportunity to really campaign for something specific and to try and make change happen. And I think that's what he really saw the task to be. So in 2010, he set up with Susie Morrow, who's here today, set up Wandsworth Living Streets and a slightly separate but parallel campaign called 20's Plenty for Wandsworth. And obviously these had general aims to improve Wandsworth streets and make life fairer for people on footing especially. But it was also, again, to pick up a specific example, it was a response to the mayor at that time, a certain current Prime Minister, who had this policy called smoothing the flow. And that was, and there's a BBC report from July 2010, which amazingly enough is still on the internet, which said it involved scrapping 145 pedestrian crossings and reviewing the timing of 1,000 others to reduce the wait time for drivers. So, and obviously, there was, from our people like us, there was general condemnation of that, but Robert was incensed that included on the list was a crossing which had been put in specifically because a pedestrian had previously been killed in that spot in Wandsworth. So it was one of those things where there was a general desire for change, but also something very specific that he felt was unjust and wanted to address. And generally over a sort of 10-year period, Robert's campaigning, and again I must insist, it was never on his own, it's always in tandem with other groups and people, and helped make great changes in Wandsworth. Wandsworth now has a 20-mile-an-hour limit on almost all of its roads, huge number of school streets, and a fantastic change in policy from basically car-friendly policies to people-friendly ones. And I know he worked really closely with Councillor John Locker, who's the cabinet member. I don't know if John's here today, but he really respected people across and worked with people across the political divide. But there was also the petition in London too, so he worked a lot in Wandsworth but also in London, and he was involved in the early Living Streets groups in London, such as the London Action Group and the City of 20 campaign in 2012. But a key change happened in 2016 with the election of Sadiq Khan, the appointment of Will Norman as not just a cycling commissioner but a walking cycling commissioner, and Robert was then at the heart of setting up London Living Streets and played a huge role ever since. He was our first secretary, but what I would say about Robert is he took on the role that nobody else wanted to do. So after he finally relinquished the role of secretary, which has been taken over so brilliantly by Michael, then we decided we needed a treasurer, and no one ever wants to be a treasurer. But Robert took on the role of treasurer, but rather than doing it in a way that was clunky, he just said, I'm just going to open my own separate personal account, I'll do it through that. So it was incredibly efficient, and then all that horror of being a treasurer was sort of negated. So there was those tasks, but he also really started to put forward policy arguments, as many other people doing, around the need for road user charging, road pricing across the whole of London, which if there's one thing that's going to change the balance between people and vehicles, it's going to be road user charging. I would advocate everybody supports it if it comes up. But again here, he was also massively practical. He worked closely with Mike Grant and the late Alistair Hampton to measure the impact of shorter pedestrian waiting times at Green Man. So we had a really good example, I think, crossing Queenstown Road earlier, where I think it took a minute or so for the light to go red. And Alistair and Mike had this fantastic idea, but it was Robert who made it happen. Robert suddenly found he was having to organise 45 citywide survey sessions, which ended up interviewing thousands of people as they were just wanting to cross the road, and they had not planned to stop it. They had not intended to stop and have a discussion about the crossing as they went on to and left each of those crossings. It was an amazing Herculean task, but it helped to prove to Transport for London engineers that simple improvements to crossing can make a real difference to pedestrians. And that work's got a real legacy, and now TfL are changing all of their 7,000 crossings across London over a 5-year period. There was, of course, so much more. Robert was always brimful of practical ideas, and I always felt I could turn to him for the help with the knottiest problems. And I just wanted to again echo one of Morris's stories. I often found myself in Waterloo Station in the Benugo above the station with a conversation with Robert, like when we had a knotty problem, saying, well, why don't we meet in Waterloo Station? It's just up the way from Clapham Junction. And we'd meet there and we'd go through an issue. And I'd always go back to Kennington feeling like, oh, I think I know what to do now. So we're going to miss Robert enormously, as we've all said, but both in Wandsworth and across London, all around you, there are traces of the work that he did that are not hard to spot. Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce my mum, Marion, and in the couple of days after Robert died, I remember Mum saying to me there were Robert-shaped holes everywhere. And I guess you've known him a long time. Not quite as long as mine. And so what Marion's going to do is just to give us a sense of the arc of Robert's life. Yeah? I'm going to get that right back. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah? Closer? Yeah? Is that okay? Yeah. Does that mean yes? Yes. So, in lieu of the time problem, I've stretched out to 2 paragraphs. And I am by background a teacher, and I do quite a lot of public speaking, and I never read what I'm going to say. I always speak, but on this occasion I think you'll forgive me if I do mostly by reading, just in case I lose my way. All the qualities about Robert could light up the day for any one of us. They were all there when he and I fell in love 58 years ago. But looking back over the arc of that shared life in 3 countries and all those different moments of history, our history and the world's history, I'm also aware of how much changed. The essential Robert was always there, but the way he used himself grew and developed in a really remarkable way. And that's what I want to share with you. To go back to where he started in Cape Town, an intellectually precocious but extremely shy young boy. He had serious asthma from birth and felt that he was constantly looked down on at school because he wasn't good at sport. He had, he said, at most 3 friends. His father, whom he greatly admired, was an outstanding human rights lawyer. At the height of the apartheid era, he put himself on the line at considerable personal cost to work for a humane, non-racial society. And that was at the core of Robert's early experience. He was 15 when he started door-to-door campaigning, which was for a Liberal Party candidate which believed in a completely non-racial franchise. In the 1950s, it was doomed, but he was there trying to persuade people for it. Morris has told you about his role as a student leader at the university. My younger cousin was in the hall on that occasion, and she said she knew from the moment she heard him speak he was special, with a great intellect and a deep humanity. But the other side of his father's legacy was a great sadness. Robert grew up under the shadow of watching his father trying to deal with recurrent, very severe depressions, and later barely managed alcoholism. Soon after we met, Robert himself suffered a mental health breakdown, and it was many months before he was able to get back to facing other people. For a couple of years he was in retreat, and I alongside him as students in Manchester, living in a tiny attic flat whose windows you couldn't see from the road below, emotionally insecure and vulnerable to depression. Yet there are friends here with us today who first met him at that time, and what they remember is his vitality, his intelligence, his strong values, his huge laughter. That experience of living at 2 levels simultaneously left him with a sensitivity to the private troubles that people have to deal with, and was part of what fueled his huge compassion. He was also beginning to explore issues that informed much of his later work that we've heard about today. He'd always loved history, but his starting point had been in a completely other era. As a child, his father had read to him from a series written at the height of confident British imperialism called High Roads of History. At 14, he was subscribing to the Reader's Digest and absorbing a 1950s Cold War view of international relationships, and reading the books of G.H. Henty, where intrepid young boys, quite unlike him, took leading roles in different historical periods. But he shed the attitudes and distilled from all of this an admiration for the people who could be seen to be fighting oppression and wanting to change things for the better. I remember a train journey, we were in our young 20s, when I was in tears because he was explaining to me with his usual clarity what socialism meant. And I realised that I was being challenged to question things that I'd always taken for granted. I was extremely upset, and in retrospect, I'm extremely grateful. When we arrived as very young adults in the newly independent Zambia, he was still deeply unconfident about his intellectual preparedness for a university teacher, to be a university teacher. From all we've heard today, it's obvious how absurd that lack of confidence was, but lack of confidence is not rational. He didn't have a PhD, and unlike his colleagues, he hadn't read all the standard texts. But that very unpreparedness became a strength. Instead of importing political theories from the West, he thrived on the challenge of learning about the society in rapid transition and sharing that exploration with his students. He knew precisely how few Class B roads had been tarred at the time of independence, and how many new primary schools had been built since. That he took Zambian society seriously in a way few other expatriates did, gave him a special place in the students' affections. One of those students has remained a lifelong friend, and though thousands of miles away, still has been carrying on concerned discussions about the state of the world by email with Robert. He would be with us today, like many, all in 4 or 5 countries of the world, who felt extremely close to Robert and are gutted that they can't be here today. But we are hoping the record of this will be able to be passed on to them. When we suddenly had to start life again in a different country, a third country, there was almost no one that he met with whom he could share his passionate interest in the things that had absorbed him in Zambia. That loss of role was perhaps as difficult to deal with as the after effects of having been in prison. Morris didn't mention the circumstances, but the university that Morris has described, where there was a very tense atmosphere, there was a student demonstration. The government closed the university, put 30 students in prison, and being quite convinced that the students couldn't have had these radical ideas on their own, they arrested a few of the lecturers, and Robert was one of them. So he spent 2 months in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison. The after effects of that was, as we said the other day, it was like post-traumatic stress disorder, which those days we didn't have the words for it. But for a year, there was no question of him getting a job, and like asylum seekers today, he wasn't allowed to get a job for the first year because he'd been admitted as a special conditions. So I went out to teach, and he became a full-time dad. He'd always been a loving and very happy dad, but now he was there every minute, hands-on, full-time dad, and he said afterwards it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. It changed him in ways that he knew were entirely positive. Just when he was emerging from this traumatic retreat, another wonderful thing happened, and he found a job with Z Press, which gave him scope for his deep desire to do something that he thought would improve the world. He always regretted that he didn't have time to study all of those books properly, that he had to scoot on and produce the next book because otherwise the company would go bankrupt. It was, by the way, a non-profit making company. Not only that it never made profits, but it never intended to make profits. When I was working for this regret of his about not being able to read all the books, constantly felt he didn't know very much. There was a specialist on Burma writing this book about Burma, and all he could do was get an overview of it very quickly, and what a pity he didn't have time to read it properly. But his range of his knowledge was absolutely extraordinary, and it just kept on growing all the time. When I was working for Save the Children, I was constantly having to go very briefly to lots of different countries, about which I knew really almost nothing. And I'd say to him, "Can you tell me something about Sudan?" And he'd start by saying, well, I don't really know anything about Sudan, and then he'd start off in a half hour later, so that I could arrive at the airport not being totally ignorant. One of the most striking changes in his own understanding during this period was about feminism. Early on in our life together, this was first in Zambia but then in London again, he found it deeply threatening that I joined a women's group, where we were discussing who knows what about the men in our lives. But through the personal experience of sharing childcare and domestic roles, and then through his reading about the situation for women across the world, he became a very ardent feminist. It was as though he'd been given a new lens through which to see the world, and he was absolutely delighted to be released from his earlier narrow vision. At PTA meetings at the children's school, it was always Robert who was doing the tea. He refused to stand as chair of the PTA because he felt it should be done by a woman. And out of that engagement with schools, he discovered, as Julie has given us so vividly a picture, what he really thrived on was working with people of all kinds, not just academics. He just loved the sociability of that campaign. And the most wonderful thing happened. He realised, kind of belatedly, that he wasn't shy anymore. Nobody had ever seen his shyness because he had this really good act. But he really was. He had to gear himself up to things. And the WASP campaign and working with all those parents, it released him to be the wonderfully loving, sociable person that he really was, for which I'm ever grateful. That carried on in every moment of his life. And I want to tell you just a couple of things from a recent time, when, as May said, he was at his happiest after he retired and could just do all the things that he thought were really important. When he set out on his early morning walks, it was before most of the world was awake, and he would meet the dustman who was pushing his cart, the one with the broom sweeping the pavements. He always stopped to chat to him. When he got home, he would tell me what he'd learnt about the man's working conditions, and I knew when the company that wanted subcontracted this work to was sold out to another company and how his working conditions changed. At the newsagent, where he picked up his daily paper, he knew each of those who worked there by their names. He knew who was responsible for stock control. He knew who was going back to India to visit his mother. It was very sad that he lived so far away. The men came to see me after Robert died. They were in deep sorrow. He never stopped reading, thinking, listening, arguing, not until his last day. When he died, there were 19 very fat books piled up next to his bed, all waiting to be read urgently. There's another bookshelf in which the labels are to be read, thoughts, important. There was always, in his last years he did get tired. I was telling a lot of our friends he's getting a lot tireder. Nobody believed me because they only saw him in action with other people. But he was getting tired, and one might have expected that his all-embracing social energy would wane, but it actually got stronger. There was always so much to be done. Each phone conversation took longer because there was only one way he could do it, and that was to be there for the person he was interacting with. The number of long-term friends he wanted to keep proper contact with grew, and there was only one way to be with them, which was fully. It's completely astonishing how many of these people, close and far away, he had spoken to in the last few months, and never briefly. Because he was as he was, each of us here felt that our relationship with him was special, because it was.